acceptable. Once again, in the sample rate, it's just not getting enough AA happening. So what we need to do is we can go to 1 and 8, and we can go to 1 and 0.015 here and do another region render. And we just clean it up a little bit. If we go into the sample rate, you'll remember what was happening, how I was saying the sample rate pass changes, is now we've got the difference between 1 and 8 subdivisions. So these green areas, if they're in between 1 and 8, green would represent 4 subdivisions. So you can see that we've essentially kept the AA the same on these areas, but increased it in other areas which need a little bit more. So you can see the difference now on the right and left here. We've got a bit more anti-aliasing on this edge as opposed to this one. In the sample rate, we've got red still happening on that edge, so that tells us now on that edge there's 8 subdivs happening, and in the darker areas we've got 1 subdiv happening, instead of here where this kind of off blue color, which is possibly going between 1 and 2 subdivs, which is what we didn't want. So effectively what we've done is we've increased the AA, and by adjusting the color threshold at the same time correctly, now we've optimized things a little bit better in the scene. Now, while we're on the topic of anti-aliasing, there's a new change in V-Ray 3 which you need to be aware of, and that's that the depth of field is now handled with the scene anti-aliasing. So in the past, when you've turned on depth of field, you'll probably notice that your render times have skyrocketed because of all the extra samples needed to clean up those blurred pixels. The same thing applies to V-Ray 3, except now if I go into the V-Ray camera, in the depth of field, there's just an options box to turn it on. There's not an actual sampling amount. That old sampling amount, and I made the mistake of incorrectly putting the wrong values in my scene because it was turned on, was directly altering the max AA. So in the V-Ray 2.4, when you put depth of field on and you set it to 100 samples for the depth of field, what you were saying you're saying make the max AA samples 100 also. So to be the equivalent, if I went in here and just made it 100. So if you look at this render here, everything's really clean. Let me just load it up again for you. Sorry, you can see what I mean by how I accidentally I go into this settings box and use this button instead of just clicking here on the interface. But you'll notice it's all really clean down the bottom of the scene. Everything's got really nice anti-aliasing. It's all really nicely balanced, and the render time's not too large. But then as we go back further and further where the depth of field kicks in, it gets more and more noisy. And the only way to fix that is to shoot more anti-aliasing samples in the scene, which is, you have to remember, V-Ray is not magical. It can't just magically add more samples in those areas. So what you have to do is you have to globally increase the AA, and it's going to result in a little bit of oversampling. You can do a little bit to try and control it with the color threshold, but ultimately what you need to do is you need to, say if we had it at 1 and 18 before, let's go up to 1 and 16. And now let's go all the way back here and do a region render. And we'll just see if that starts to improve it. It might not though, because of the color threshold not being low enough. And as you can see, it's not. So in the sample rate here, it's effectively just producing the same level of anti-aliasing. So we need to go down on the color threshold, because when you blur pixels, look at the difference. There's not a very high difference, you're just blurring it. So if I go down to 0.01 now, now we should see those areas start to brighten up in the sample rate pass, which you can see here. They're brightening up a little bit because we're shooting more samples into the scene in those areas. And at 100% now the noise finally starts to clear up a little bit. But that will come at the expense of render time. So when you're working with depth of field now, just remember that this is another great example of how having this divide shading subdivs option unticked makes things simpler, because now you can change the anti-aliasing irrespective of the samples on the floor. So it's not actually affecting things in a negative way when you go up. All you're doing is you're just saying, just shoot more AA into the scene, and that's it. I only want to improve the depth of field, so all I need to do is increase the AA, and that should solve it. You can go really low now with this color threshold in order to solve depth of field. It's really the only way to do it, but it's not like it's making your render times longer than they were before. It's just a simpler, more unified way of looking at the render settings. So in that respect, it's another positive change in V-Ray 3. But with that being said, now we've got this clean render, and if I went in and re-rendered the whole thing, all the depth of field would look a little bit cleaner. But there's a couple of little things I need to tell you right before we move on to using the progressive image sampler, and that's that in that last render I ticked on use Embry. If you've got an Intel CPU, always have this ticked, because it's a new implementation of raycasting that Intel developed to speed up calculations like, Russian roulette ray tracing, and which V-Ray takes a lot more advantage of now. And basically it's just going to give you a render time increase anywhere between 1 to 30%. I haven't done extensive testing yet. V-Ray 3 is pretty new, so it's going to take me, a few months of getting used to a variety of different scenes and knowing the settings that are best set up with those scenes, and also knowing expected render times. But I've got Intel CPUs here, so that's always ticked on. You can't use it if you've got an AMD CPU, but that basically sums up the Embry Raycaster. Another thing is now you'll remember in that first lesson how we changed the bucket width to be smaller to increase the render time. Now we've got this dynamic splitting option, which I said was going to be in V-Ray 3, and now it's finally implemented. So what this dynamic splitting option box does is it tells you that if I start out with a certain render size, as the render gets to those last threads, instead of only 2 threads working on the box, it's going to divide up that bucket so that more threads can work on it at once. I'll give you an example of that. I'll just render a region here. And you can see it, dynamic splitting is turned on and it's set to size. You've got 2 different options. If I set it to count and render, you'll just see what it does here. And now you can see these smaller buckets are happening because we've got so many threads working on it that if all the threads working on it were the same size, it wouldn't be utilizing all 4 render boxes and my main workstation. So it just helps speed things up a little bit. Now if I set it to size and re-render, you'll see that it dynamically changes the size of the render buckets to fit what it is it dynamically changes the size to best fit how many threads I've got going on the scene. So when all those render boxes are kicking in, it basically does that guesstimation for you, which is great. It's an awesome feature, and it on a print job where you've got a bucket size of say 128 and a 7K job, when you get down to those last buckets that in the past would have taken 5-10 minutes to clear up just one bucket, now it's using all the CPUs and all the threads to clean that up, and you do get, you might not realize it, but a pretty big render improvement just by that one little smart way of thinking about it. It's not making V-Ray any faster, it's just changing the way of thinking about how to speed up the render, just like a little trick, which is great. So just one last thing before I jump onto the progressive image sampler. We've got a setting here which I left out in the first lesson, which I'm now going to explain to you what it does, and that's the adaptive amount. So basically, when you've got all your scene subdivisions set up, like GI, lighting, and your reflection subdivs, this adaptive amount tells V-Ray how many by default to throw into the scene before it starts adding more based on the noise threshold. So an example of that would be, say you have an interior render, and in the shadows here, all this area needs a very large amount of shadow samples to clean up. Or you've got an interior with GI bouncing everywhere. The way V-Ray works is, in both the anti-aliasing and the way it samples things like lights and materials, is it tries to do it adaptively. If pixels don't need more samples, it does calculations to make sure that they're not getting as many samples as the places that do need them. However, that takes calculation power itself, thus slowing down the render. So when you get a scene where it's less adaptive in the amount of sampling the scene needs, so right now this scene, for example, the floor isn't reflective, so all these areas, they don't need any samples. However, the material ball needs lots of samples. So that's an example where you need that adaptivity, and that's where you'd set the adaptivity higher, because V-Ray can then make the decision to use the bare minimum of 8 in these areas and the max of whatever subdiv setting I've got on the reflection, which would be the power of 32 on the ball itself. So to speed up your renders when you've got interiors and you've got scenes that you notice noise everywhere, like a large amount of noise everywhere, that's where you drop the adaptive amount down. So if I set, at the moment, what it's doing is, at 0.8, is it's saying, by default, at the start of the render, shoot 20% of every subdiv setting in the scene subdivs into the scene, by default. So it's saying shoot 20% of 32 in, shoot 20% of 32 GI subdivs in, and on the light it's saying shoot 20% of 16 subdivs in. If I go into the adaptive amount and drop that to 0.5, then all of a sudden it's saying shoot the power of 16 in, or half of every scene subdivision setting, shoot that into the scene. So you can what that does is it makes V-Ray less adaptive. It stops doing those calculations to determine if different parts of the image need more samples, and the end result is a faster render. I didn't fully understand that during the first lesson. Like I understood what it was doing technically, but I didn't understand how much of a positive effect that can have on scenes until I started rendering interiors. Now, I'm not an interior artist, but as a lot of you guys on the course are, I've had to kind of adapt and learn some of those tricks and techniques that you guys need to speed up renders. So if you're an ArcViz artist and you're doing lots of heavy interiors, it's probably better to start with a lower adaptive amount. Now set that up first in the scene, and that way you'll know how many scene subdivisions to set. So right now I've already set it to 32 and 16, but if I drop that adaptive amount down, what that might do is it might start oversampling areas. So the whole idea of this course is to try and make you a little bit more intuitive and to start knowing what settings to use, just roughly, not knowing exactly what settings to use, but on different scenes you'll have a basic idea of what settings to use. So now we're just going to get on to the progressive image sampler, and when I'm done with that, that will be the first part of this V-Ray 3 introduction lesson. Now there's still quite a few things I need to cover, but during the course of making this video, there's been a couple of little technical problems I need to discuss with Vlado, which have prevented me from releasing it, even though I've been recording it all day. So that will be released next week, but we're going to get onto the progressive render engine now, and I'm going to show you how that works and how you can get the most out of that. And that will also introduce the next little button that Vlado implemented, which is the, let me just find it here, sorry, which is the minimum shading rate. And I'm going to explain what that does. So with the progressive image sampler, because this divide shading subdivs button has only just been implemented, turning it off breaks the progressive image sampler I've found. I don't know if it's a technical issue, I'll follow it up in a later lesson, but so far I've only been able to make this progressive sampler work correctly when it's on its default, which is turned on. So I've swapped to progressive, and in the GI settings I've gone back to 8. In the light settings, I'll go back to 8, and also in the material settings, I'll go back to 8. Now you can see here, when I go to the progressive image sampler tab, we've got a min-max subdivs setting, which is the anti-aliasing, and a render time dialog box, a noise threshold dialog box, and a ray bundle size dialog box. Now the minimum maximum subdivs behaves the exact same way as the adaptive image sampler. However, this time around, the benefit of using a progressive image sampler is it doesn't have to stop rendering. It will keep getting cleaner and cleaner until you're happy. Now there's pros and cons to that. The cons are when you're rendering the whole image at the same time, you have to wait much longer to see what it's going to be like fully noise free. However, you get a much better understanding of what the overall lighting of a scene would look like and the overall look and feel of the image would be like, as opposed to working the way I do, which is zoomed in and rendering crop renders. Now, when I'm working because the image sampler is render size dependent, i.e. when you make the render bigger, the samples are spread out, there's more pixels in the scene, the sample rate pass behaves differently, and the anti-aliasing behaves differently. So I'm forced, just by the nature of my job, to work like that, to work in the final resolution. So if I was doing a print job, I'd have this height set to 8000, and I'd probably turn on crop rendering, and I'd just go in and render a region like that, and then I'd do it again and again. I might swap to region and just do little bits and pieces. But when you're working with a progressive image sampler, you're refining the whole thing at once. So personally, I'm not a major fan of it, but I definitely think there's uses for it, because if you were rendering out an animation, you could set some low quality settings, set the render off, and say you had 100 frames to render, you could set the max render time to be a minute, and you'd know no matter what in 100 minutes that you'd have that render completed. Noisy or not, you'd still be able to see it. So there's some pretty good benefits to it, but the negatives are you have to wait to see what the final quality of your materials and lighting will look like. So a good starting point is basically what these default settings are, is 1 and 100. And if you have the render time at 0, basically what that tells you is that you have control over when to stop the image. Now, I'd probably set the render time before changing the subdivs, because it'd be much more predictable just to set a longer render time. But in terms of the noise threshold, you can also set that so that the render will stop after it hits that threshold. So I've just set the render height back to 800 by 600, and I'll get it rendering progressively now. Now, as you'll see, when this is rendering, it calculates the light cache first, just like usual, and then just starts working through the passes. And basically the way this progressive image sampler works by default with this min shading rate set to 1 is it's working like Vlado's universal settings, where the majority of the work is being done by the anti-aliasing. So if I go into the reflection pass, for example, you can see it's quite noisy, whereas already there's quite good AA in the scene. Even down here, the AA is better than where I had it at with my adaptive settings. However, there's a bit of noise in the GI, and there's a bit of noise in the reflections and things like that. So the global scene settings with this default min shading rate of 1 aren't really balanced. So there's more work being put in the AA and less on the global settings. Now to counter that, that's where this min shading rate setting comes in. And if I set that to 2, it's saying for every anti-aliasing sample I put in the scene, put 2 global scene samples on that pixel. Now there's one little bit of confusion that I haven't fully clarified yet, and that's if changing this min shading rate overrides your global scene settings. I need to figure that out with Vlado. But for the sake of this lesson and going off what I've observed happen, I personally feel like this min shading rate overrides the other settings. So this progressive image sampler is much simpler to handle. So if by default I was getting that really nice clean AA at the start but not enough global scene subdivs, what I can do is I can raise that higher to say for 8, for example. So now for every anti-aliasing sample it's throwing at the scene, it's throwing 8 scene samples for the materials and the lighting and the GI. And if I render that again, the anti-aliasing will be worse at the start, however the GI and everything will clear up a bit faster. So here you can see it's calculating it again. The AA this time is really noisy, but as you'll see soon enough when it clears, that the GI and things start clearing faster. So it's almost as if it's overriding the scene settings. Now I'd hate if I was wrong on that, because I'd have to go in and fix that up in a later lesson, but the render documentation doesn't actually describe that. I've got it up now, and you can see here it says the min shading rate. This option allows you to control the number of rays shot for anti-aliasing versus rays for other effects like glossy reflections, GI, area, shadows, etc. It is especially useful with the progressive image sampler. So higher values mean less time will be spent on the AA and more effort will be put into the shading effects. What it doesn't say is if that overrides the settings in the scene itself, because I've done tests and I've changed the GI from 8 to 32 and I didn't notice any difference. The only thing that was affecting it was the min shading rate itself, but changing the GI with this progressive image sampler on wasn't having effect. So it might just be my bad observation there, but that's basically how the progressive image sampler works. And you can see you get really nice clean results really quickly, and the only drawback for me is that when you're dealing with 7K print renders, it's not viable because you're waiting so long to see the final clean result. That being said, you can also use it at the start of your job to narrow things down. It's kind of like V-Ray RT on steroids because it's got no limitations. It works with volume fog, it works with all V-Ray settings, unlike RT, which obviously is using a different setup and has limitations. So that about wraps up the first part of this lesson, where I just wanted to show you that new workflow. In the second part, I'll be covering things like the ray traced subsurface scattering now, the V-Ray 3 skin shader, just a quick run through of that. I'll show you this new bloom and glare dialog box. On top of everything else, I'm going to show you the new color correction tools that are available now and how you can load custom cube files and LUT files, OCI files and ICC color profiles. So if you use grading software like DaVinci Resolve, I think you can actually export color settings from those programs, like Nuke for example, load them into V-Ray. So if you're working on your comp, you can render out your jobs with the exact same color profile as you're using in Nuke, which is really great if you don't have time and you're rendering out an animation. You can do quite a little bit of grading within inside V-Ray itself. I will go over these quick settings, however I'm not going to use them, and I wouldn't recommend you guys to use them, but they're there for you if you can't be bothered. So there's that also. But I'll be releasing that video next week, and if I do need to go in and refine this progressive image sampler, that will be included also. I just haven't had time this week to talk to Vido about it and get his opinion on what's actually happening when you use that progressive image sampler. But for now, you can see the benefits and the pros and cons. So I'll see you next week, and I hope you really do enjoy V-Ray 3. It was a massive release. They really outdid themselves with the number of small little things that most companies would overlook, and they'd only try and include really flashy big settings. But it seems like with Chaos Group, things that something like Autodesk, if they implemented this quick settings, that's what they would be branding just because it's cool and new and intuitive. However, Chaos Group tend to be a lot more realistic with what users actually want. So I was heavily involved during the beta of this release, and it was just awesome just to see how devoted they were to really implementing things that people wanted. In the first service pack, which should be released in a couple of months based on what I was hearing on the forums, we'll also have the GGX shader implementation. And as all these new features are coming in, whether it's a service pack or a new version, I'll always just keep you guys up to date with that. And if I'm not fully sure of something and I need to go back and reevaluate things, you'll constantly have that up-to-date information. So that's the point and the purpose of this subscription model. So like usual, if you've got any questions, just feel free to email me or ask me something you want on Facebook. But I'm really enjoying it now with this new setup. It's really great. As you can tell with the new microphone, the voice has become a lot clearer. And so once again, thanks heaps, everybody. I'll see you next week.